Welcome, Mr. Gnome. What if I told you that in 2019, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia was predicted and promoted in a US policy research paper? Well, that is true, and the name of that paper is called Extending Russia, made in 2019. Now, in today's video, I will go through the main points of this paper in regards to the conflict of Ukraine and Russia, because this policy paper actually explains how to use the Ukrainian people against Russia so that Russia would overextend and would have to tie up Russian resources so that United States would ultimately win geopolitically against Russia. There are a lot of other points in this paper as well, so I will glance through those points as well, but I will mainly focus on the Ukraine and Russia conflict because, in my opinion, that is the most interesting and pressing matter in this policy paper. Now, I understand when making this video, I will sound pro-Russian, but in reality, I am neutral observer of events. I am neither pro-Ukraine or pro-Russia, but when I explain this policy paper, it objectifies the Ukrainian people very badly. So it's essentially unavoidable. But this policy paper is made by the RAND Corporation. So before we get started, I just want to give a brief explanation what is RAND. So RAND was established in the 1950s, and it has helped shape United States policy in regards to Cold War, US involvement in the Vietnam War, and the US-Soviet nuclear arms confrontation conflict. So this is essentially a military-industrial think tank in the United States, and it receives both public and private funding. So it's essentially in the conjuncture of the two, and it has received $514 million in 2024. So it's a massive think tank with a lot of resources, and some people could say that this is part of the American deep state as well. But anyway, let's get to the policy paper and let's download the PDF. At the end of the video, I will give you guys a couple of updates from RAND after this paper came out to see how they have fared in their predictions and policy guidance. So now let's get started. So this is the policy paper here, Extending Russia. And you can see it was made in 2019. There's 354 pages in total. So let me get to the most interesting parts here. So the table of contents is very long here. We will mostly focus on how to provide lethal aid to Ukraine. And again, this was 2019, 2 years before the full-on war started. They also talk about the Syrian rebels, regime change in Belarus, exploiting tensions in the South Caucasus, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia, challenging Russian presence in Moldova, and many, many other ideological informational measures, air and space measures, maritime measures, land and multi-domain measures, all kinds of measures essentially to hinder Russia. Now, going to the summary, I will give you guys a brief summary of the table of contents here, and then we will go to the specific section on Ukraine because that is very telling. So in this paper, we examine a range of non-violent measures that could exploit Russia's actual vulnerabilities and anxieties as a way of stressing Russia's military and economy and the regime's political standing at the home and abroad. They want to unbalance Russia, causing Russia to overextend itself militarily or economically, or causing the regime to lose domestic and/or international prestige and influence. Of all of the measures we examined, expanding US energy production and imposing trade and financial sanctions on Russia seem most likely. So that is their preferred method. Global oil prices and production are beyond the full control of a single country, but the United States can adopt policies that expand world supply of oil and thus depress global prices thereby limiting Russian revenue. Well, right now, when we zoom back to today, obviously the oil prices are not under wraps because United States has decided that the conflict in Iran is more important than the conflict in Ukraine. Now, that obviously there's always conflict of interest between these different interests. So since Russia is still surviving, this part here has essentially failed in this policy paper already. Imposing tougher sanctions is also likely to degrade the Russian economy. Well, that is exactly what we have seen throughout the conflict. Increase Europe's ability to import gas. This has also happened. So right now, about 60% of Europe's LNG is coming from the United States, but that is an outdated number because the Strait of Hormuz is now closed. The amount of LNG going into Europe from United States, the total amount is probably closer to 80% as of now. I haven't checked the latest numbers, but because the Hormuz is closed, obviously United States has to increase the amount of gas supplied to Europe. They want to also encourage immigration from Russia, essentially brain drain, so get the educated youth out of Russia. Ideological and informational measures, Western propaganda is mentioned here. But if they do propaganda attempts at Russia, this could give the regime both cover and an incentive to institute a violent crackdown on domestic anti-regime groups and activists. And this is again what we have seen since the full war broke out. This approach might initiate a second ideological Cold War between Russia and the West. Well, I believe we are already in Cold War 2.0. Sometimes I call it the World War 3 already, because that is essentially where all of this is currently trending. None of these wars that are currently out seem to be de-escalating rather than they are escalating rapidly. Geopolitical measures, so they explain all of the different ways they can use United States to essentially overextend Russia geopolitically. One of them is Syria. So in Syria, United States actually made a big win, and also Israel made a big win when they were able to overthrow the government. Then they talk about Ukraine. So the Ukrainian military already is bleeding Russia in the Donbass region and vice versa. Providing more US military equipment and advice could lead Russia to increase its direct involvement in the conflict and the price it pays for it. Russia might respond by mounting a new offensive and seizing more Ukrainian territory. While this might increase Russia's cost, it would also represent a setback for the United States as well as for Ukraine. So they already essentially predicted what it would cause when they push Ukraine towards closer towards NATO, as well as they give more and more military support for Ukraine. So Russia essentially responded exactly as they feared Russia would respond, which is invading Ukraine. Then obviously they talked about Syria as well, but they succeeded there. Russia enjoys even greater geographic advantages in the Caucasus, making it considerably more expensive, for instance, for the United States to defend Georgia. So Georgia regime change operation essentially has been cancelled for now. But they talk about Moldova, and if you look at today, in today's Moldova, there's a massive push to get Moldova into the EU umbrella. So that is going on in Moldova as of today. And then Belarus. Belarus is Russia's only real ally, successfully promoting regime change in Belarus and altering the country's orientation westward would be a real blow to Moscow. But the prospects of a so-called color revolution in Minsk are poor. And should one become imminent, Russia might well intervene militarily to prevent it. Again, this would extend Russia, but generally be regarded as a setback for the United States. So essentially, they advise not trying to do a regime change operation in the Belarus. And then increasing military advice and arms supplies to Ukraine is the most feasible out of these options with the largest impact. But any such initiative would have to be calibrated very carefully to avoid a widely expanded conflict, which is exactly what ultimately happened. For air and space measures, this is outside of Ukraine, but the best cost imposing strategies for Russia are including investments in long range cruise missiles, long range anti radiation missiles, and if they are affordable enough to be produced in high numbers, autonomous or remotely piloted aircraft, aka drones. All of this would essentially cause Russia to create a counter which would extend Russia's resources and hinder Russia's growth. And then maritime measures, more aggressive US and allied patrolling near Russian naval bases in the Arctic, Baltic, and Black Seas. Deploying land-based or air-launched anti-ship cruise missiles on NATO's Black Sea coast could compel Russia to strengthen defenses of its Crimean bases. Romania would likely be the most willing candidate for such basing. So Romania is mentioned here as well. And then let's talk about NATO. So NATO allies in this policy paper, they encourage NATO allies to increase their self-defense investments so that Russia would have to respond by spending more money on military. So continuing to press NATO allies to improve the capabilities of their own forces could lead to a more productive use of Western resources, larger, more frequent, and shorter notice NATO exercises in Europe would be a good idea. And ending the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty, regime might be advantageous as well. So United States essentially wants to get out of the treaties surrounding the use of nuclear weapons so that Russia has to spend more money on nuclear weapons. Just want to stop here a little bit. When I'm reading this, it already sounds insane, but this is how the military-industrial complex thinks. It objectifies everything and everyone for the main benefit of the military-industrial complex in this geopolitical landscape so that their team ultimately wins and they can use pawns in the field for their ultimate objectives. It's essentially a massive war game for these people. But now let's continue. Incremental investments in new technologies, compelling increased Russian investment in countermeasures, non-traditional weapons, so these are alien weapons like energy, electromagnetic, geophysical, genetic weapons, and radiological weapons, so theoretical weapons. And conclusion, Russia's greatest vulnerability is its economy, highly dependent on energy exports. So in that sense, if they can push the oil prices lower, that would be the best policy choice to hinder Russia. Well, obviously that has completely failed with oil pushing for $100 a barrel. Russia's greatest strength in the military and information warfare realms. The most promising measures to stress Russia are those which directly address these vulnerabilities, anxieties, and strengths, exploiting areas of weakness while undermining Russia's current advantages. Continuing to expand US energy production, well, that is what Trump is currently doing with the drill baby drill idea. And also Trump has increased the coal production under the some War Measures Act or something like this recently. Sanctions on Russia, Ukraine and Syria mentioned once again, and Syria might have been a more promising ground to promote local opposition to Russian presence in 2015, but there was a setback, but they already succeeded there. Entering into an arms race with Russia would be the riskiest of measures. So the idea that they suggest against is to go to an arms race, but an arms race is exactly what the Europe and Russia are in right now. When you look at the rhetoric coming from the European Union, they always talk about more drone investments, anti-drone investments, and now even starting to talk about nuclear arming different nations inside Europe. So an arms race is essentially where the countries are at the moment. NATO members might provoke Russian reactions elsewhere, but is it time to go to the Ukraine section? Let's go there. So it's on page 124, and I will skip the other parts because this is the most interesting part, how they planned to use Ukraine against Russia. So measure number one, the favorite method, providing lethal aid to Ukraine. First, they talk about the events leading to the current conflict. So actually, everything started in 2013 when there were protests, pro-American protests in Ukraine, and that essentially caused ultimately an overthrow, a coup in Ukraine. This policy paper tells the very pro Western side of the story. It doesn't say the pro-Russian side of the story, but I'm not going to go into that in this video. Ultimately, what happened is there was a pro-Western coup, and in response, Russia seized Crimea, and 96% of Crimean voters voted to join Russia. And that is what happened, even though this 96% number has been marred by accusations of fraud, even though nothing has ever been proven to be true. And then after this land grab or annexation by Russia, there was another attempt in Donetsk and Luhansk, but this time Ukraine fought back, and that was in 2014. And then the Ukraine civil war started from 2014 to 2022. So for 8 years, there were 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers, 40,000 pro-Russian Ukrainians, plus maybe 5,000 Russian soldiers fighting each other, with a total of some 10,000 people losing their lives in that civil war. Sanctions on Russia and provided the United States and its European allies imposed economic sanctions on Russia and provided Ukraine with economic and non-lethal military assistance and lethal assistance, but they don't mention that in this paper. But here's essentially for today. While NATO's requirement for unanimity makes it unlikely that Ukraine could gain membership in the foreseeable future, Washington's pushing this possibility could boost Ukrainian resolve while leading Russia to redouble its efforts to forestall such a development. So they already predict that Ukraine will never join NATO, so it will not become part of NATO, but they will dangle the NATO carrot in front of Ukraine so that Ukrainians believe they can get into NATO, and that could boost the Ukrainian resolve, the Ukrainian morale, and also cause Russia to overreact to the Ukrainian threat. Well, that is exactly what happened. Now let's see what benefits they predicted from this policy. Expanding US assistance to Ukraine will likely increase the cost to Russia, obviously. It will also cause more Russian aid, more additional Russian troop presence, larger expenditures of Russia, Russian equipment losses, and Russian casualties. This is the benefit. Well, what about the risks? An increase in US security assistance to Ukraine would likely lead to a commensurate increase in both Russian aid to the separatists and Russian military forces in Ukraine. Well, that is obviously what happened. And the fighting would go to a higher level of intensity. In fact, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of US Army Europe, argued against giving Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine for precisely this reason. Well, nowadays, if you critique Western countries giving aid to Russia, that is immediately labeled as pro-Russian stance. But this was a highly popular stance before, so that we could avoid a larger conflict. But nowadays, obviously, you cannot say anything like that, or you are immediately labeled as pro-Russian. You always have to give more support to Ukraine, regardless of Russia's possible countermeasure. And then alternatively, Russia might counter-escalate, pushing them deeper into Ukraine. Get this, at the expense of the Ukrainian people. So this is where I become a little bit critical, obviously, as you can hear from my voice. But they already predict that going this path would cause massive damages to the Ukrainian people. And in Ukraine now, the men, adult men, haven't been able to leave the country, and there's a forced conscription for the second year in a row already in Ukraine, meaning that if you are conscripted to the army, you have to fight, or you will go to prison, or you are essentially executed. That is the policy in Ukraine as of now. So all of the Western countries support this policy as of now. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and the US. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows, exactly like we have seen. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. Well, that is what we are essentially looking at as of today, as Russia keeps advancing on the battlefield, and it is attriting the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. Slowly, I understand, but it is still essentially moving toward Ukraine rather than moving toward Russia. Some analysts maintain that Russia lacks the resources to escalate the conflict. Clearly, that was wrong. Russia simply cannot afford to maintain a proxy war in Ukraine. Well, we are now 4+ years into the war. Oil prices are higher than almost ever. So Russia's war machine is gaining more money out of this oil price increase. This might be an overly optimistic assumption that Russia cannot afford to maintain a proxy. Well, clearly it was an overly optimistic assumption. There is also some risk of weapons supplied to the Ukrainians winding up in the wrong hands, potential misuse of Western military aid. While Ukraine has been tarred by Russian propaganda claims that it mishandled Western military aid, the RAND team also found that Ukraine's paper systems for tracking equipment are outdated and vulnerable to corruption. Well, isn't this also what we have seen throughout this conflict? There's always some corruption scandal in Ukraine, and one of the newest scandals that happened, the best friend of Zelensky, he fled the country into Israel with the money, but the war still continues and the Western aid still continues. But as it says here, Ukraine cannot be trusted with high-tech systems. The RAND team also concluded, however, that these problems are fixable and offered recommendations to Ukraine. On the other hand, Ukraine is certainly a more capable and reliable partner than others to whom the United States has provided lethal equipment, for example, the Afghans. One might imagine an unknowledge US effort to provide Ukraine with weapons of non-US origin, essentially giving Ukraine military aid without publicly disclosing giving it to Ukraine. While we have seen CIA bases being revealed in Ukraine already, that happened at the start of the war, if you remember. More vocal US advocacy of NATO membership for Ukraine would likely strengthen both Ukrainian morale and Russian determination to prevent such development, thereby perhaps further extending Russia's commitment and costs. Such a move would also endanger position within NATO, detracting from what has otherwise been rather united front in opposition to Russian aggression, essentially causing disruption inside NATO. Likelihood of success. Increasing US military aid would certainly drive up Russian costs, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. Conclusion. The option of expanding US military aid to Ukraine has been evaluated principally on whether doing so could help end the conflict in the Donbass on acceptable terms, rather than simply on costs it imposes on Moscow. So the original idea was that giving military aid to Ukraine would end the conflict faster rather than cause an escalatory spiral downwards. Well, unfortunately, we have the escalatory downward spiral. So, and obviously, then they talk about the Syrian rebels and all kinds of things in this paper as well. But I'm not going to get into those things. So, essentially, in summary, from my perspective, this paper here, the basic idea is good, that they want to extend Russia, but the way they essentially throw the Ukrainian lives in chaos in this is something that is simply unfathomable to a civilian like me. But this is their policy, and this is essentially what the United States ended up doing, and then Russia responded as you would expect Russia to do as well. Now let's take a look at a couple of the updates from RAND Corporation. Here's a 2026 update and 2021 update. First, I will talk about the 2021 update because this happened almost exactly 2 months before Russia invaded Ukraine. So the commentary or the post by a RAND, what was the person here? William Courtney is and senior fellow at the RAND Corporation, was an ambassador to Kazakhstan, Georgia, and US-USSR negotiations. So this guy created this article. So if Russia would invade Ukraine, and this came out in December 8th, 2021, this militarization could cause dramatic increase in defense spending by both United States and NATO over the next decade. So they already predicted that if Russia invaded Ukraine, this would become an extended war and prolonged war. This year, Russia has undertaken a majority military buildup near Ukraine's border and Crimea. Moscow has called up tens of thousands of reservists. And last month in Moscow, CIA director and former US ambassador William Burns conveyed a warning that Russia may be planning an invasion. Ukraine, with substantial help from the United States and NATO, is prepared to deter and defend against attack. Ukrainians can fight. Aid could include hundreds of anti-tank and anti-aircraft launchers and thousands of missiles, such as javelins and older TOW missiles. Low-cost military equipment and all kinds of other military equipment. But if Ukraine does not break, Russia could pay a high price. That is essentially coming back to the policy paper that they predicted, that they want Russia to pay as much as possible, and Ukrainian lives are just a side product. A likely Western response to new Russian aggression may be expanded training and equipping the Ukrainian forces, plus imposition of financial and economic sanctions on Russia. The United States and NATO allies might consider intervening with their own forces. But 4 years later, they still really haven't done this, except they are training personnel and as well as there are mercenaries, which most likely have direct links to the governments, but they are officially just mercenaries rather than working directly under those different countries. So pretty accurate assessment 2 months before the war, I have to say, from this policy paper. And here they also say, while Ukrainians may be unable to defeat a large-scale invasion, they could inflict high casualties, a sensitive issue in Russia. Occupying forces might be stressed thin and vulnerable to stay behind insurgents. In sum, the United States and its NATO allies and Ukraine could impose immediate and painful costs on any Russian invaders, and for many years thereafter, Russia could face reinforced NATO military power. So even in this 2021 update, they don't talk about Ukrainian victory. Rather, they talk about Ukraine being able to inflict costs and pain on Russia. But ultimately, like we saw in this policy paper, is the disadvantageous peace settlement for Ukraine, essentially throwing Ukraine under the bus, if I am frank. Now let's go to the 2026 update. This time, the update is coming from Howard J. Schutz, and he is a senior economist at RAND and a professor of policy analysis in the RAND School of Public Policy. And this update here is from January 30th, 2026, which means it was before the war started against Iran. So in this article here, they speculate on the potential ceasefire and peace deal with Russia and Ukraine. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Ukraine will become the site of the largest reconstruction project since World War II. The World Bank estimates more than $500 billion will be spent in the country over the next decade. And this would cause Ukraine to become the business opportunity of the decade. One of the Ukraine's strongest opportunities will be its defense technology, an area where engagement with Russia, which relies on China for its defense materials, offers little to the United States. Ukraine has become a global model for defense technology innovation. Ukrainian firms are already partnering with the US companies to develop prototypes of one-way long-range unmanned aerial systems. Then there's a lot of other investment ideas, mostly to do with military. But then this is hilarious commentary. Well, maybe it wasn't hilarious before, but reading it now after the Iran war has started, it says Russia faces a grim economic outlook. Its wartime economy, highly distorted and slowing, has become more centralized and less productive. Its rule of law is weak and it lacks reliable contract enforcement. It isn't clear that Russian leadership even wants to take on the monumental challenge of converting from a wartime to a civilian economy. Western sanctions are likely to continue for years too. There are still opportunities to be found in Russia, but they are likely open only to the largest players who can bear high risks. In contrast, Ukrainians have an optimistic future with the West. With US and European support, Ukraine is poised to emerge as a secure, sovereign state, deeply integrated with the global economy. When that happens, it will not only be a symbol of resilience, will be the business opportunity of the decade. In this section here, I have to strongly disagree. When we take a look at the Russian economy, the value of the ruble has risen against the dollar in the last years. Also, when we just take a look at the Russian spending on war, this says that this is a wartime economy for Russia, which unfortunately is not true. Because for Russia, they currently spend about 6% of their GDP in war, which means that they are still on the brink of wartime economy, but they are not in a wartime economy fully, at least yet. And because of the war against Iran, Russia's profitability has risen dramatically. As the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, Russia is one of the key providers of energy globally for now. So Russian energy is in high demand. As much as they can export, they can, and they make money out of it, even despite sanctions. And then when we take a look at the debt to GDP ratio by country, when we look at different countries here, you can, for example, see Japan has 237% debt to their GDP. United States has 124% debt to GDP ratio. But when we go all the way down here on this list, Russia has only 16.4% debt to GDP, which means they currently are able to sustain this level of conflict without gaining debt. So I don't really understand the point how Russia is facing a grim economic outlook. On the contrary, looking at Ukraine, there's a large exodus of Ukrainians leaving Ukraine, and because of the forced conscription, they have to pull men out of critical industries to fight the war on the front. So maybe if they can find a peace deal, a ceasefire, then Ukraine can become the business opportunity of the decade. But I feel like this analysis here is massively optimistic, whereas my take is kind of maybe even pessimistic, but I would say closer to reality, that Russia will do fine. But I do worry, as this conflict continues, that the demands from Russia to Ukraine will start to increase, and these escalations will continue to increase, and the Ukrainian population continues to dwindle, and the Ukrainian economy continues to dwindle underneath, making it even harder for Ukrainians. Now, this does cause costs to Russia as well. It's not a free war for Russia. But out of these two countries, it is Russia that is increasing its capabilities worldwide with nuclear technology, missile technology that they can export overseas, and with their energy products that they can also export at high prices as of now. So anyway, that's the full paper with my commentary as well. I know I sound pro-Russian, but again, I have no horse in this fight. I hope that the war would end, but now I have given essentially the overview of the policy paper extending Russia with my commentary. Let me know in the comments, how do you feel about this paper and my commentary? Like the video if you liked it, consider subscribing if you want to see my updates and other videos. I will see you guys on the next one. Bye bye.